Millionaire hides his wife in his mansion out of shame and goes to a party with another woman. The reflection in the Venetian crystal mirror didn't lie. Emma Westfield adjusted her silk robe around her body as she watched the luxury cars arriving at the mansion through the window of her West Wing bedroom. Once again, she was confined to her quarters during one of the social events that her husband, Charles Westfield, valued so much. The sound of elegant laughter and the clink of champagne glasses echoed through the ornate hallways of the Greenwich, Connecticut estate, constantly reminding her of her position in that house, a well-kept secret. 5 years ago, when she met Charles at the Boston Public Library where she taught literature, Emma would never have imagined that her fairy tale would have such a bitter script. The heir to the Westfield Properties empire had been enchanted by his intelligence and simplicity, characteristics that now seemed to embarrass him among his high society peers. "Mrs. Westfield?" The soft voice of Martha, the housekeeper who had become his only confidant in the mansion, interrupted his thoughts. "I brought your dinner." Emma smiled sadly, eyeing the silver tray with a meal prepared especially for her. "Thanks, Martha. Can you tell me who's down there this time?" "The usual, ma'am. Mr. Westfield's inner circle, the Richardsons, the Campbells, and of course Miss Victoria Bennet." The name of Charles' executive assistant made Emma involuntarily clench her fists. Victoria, with her impeccable pedigree and enviable social connections, represented everything Emma was supposedly not. In recent months, she had noticed the looks exchanged between Victoria and Charles, the closeness that went beyond a mere professional relationship. "Martha," Emma hesitated for a moment. "Do you think my husband still loves me?" The housekeeper nervously adjusted her apron. "Love sometimes gets lost along the way when people worry too much about what other people think, ma'am." Martha's words echoed in Emma's mind as she walked to her desk, where a golden invitation to the Westfield annual charity ball rested. The most prestigious event on Greenwich's social calendar, taking place in just 3 days at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan. As usual, Charles had said he would attend alone, or rather, accompanied by Victoria, his assistant and public relations representative for the company. Emma opened her desk drawer and took out a credit card that Charles had given her for emergencies. After 5 years of silent humiliation, perhaps it was time to create his own emergency. Meanwhile, downstairs, Charles Westfield navigated his guests with ease, his gold Rolex sparkling in the lights of the crystal chandelier. Tall, with perfectly coiffed brown hair and a tailored Italian suit, he was the very embodiment of American success. "Charles, darling," Victoria approached, her red dress gliding gracefully across the marble floor. "The Campbells are asking about that project in Palm Beach." He smiled, discreetly placing his hand on the small of her back. "Let's go to them." Before they moved, Victoria whispered, "Everything is ready for the ball. I'm sure we'll make the perfect impression." The Westfield Empire had been built by 3 generations of ambitious men and socially adequate women. Charles carried the weight of this heritage in every decision he made. His father, Preston Westfield III, had made it clear on his deathbed that the family name was his most prized possession. The next day, Emma made a call that would change everything. "Hello, Madame Rochelle. This is Emma Westfield. I need a dress for the Westfield charity ball." "Yes, something that makes a statement." In the days that followed, she planned every detail of her appearance. The private driver, hired in secret, the makeup and hair done in one of Manhattan's most exclusive salons, and the dress. Oh, the dress was a work of art in itself. The plan was simple and, at the same time, devastating. Emma knew that Charles always arrived at exactly 9 o'clock for important events. He liked to make his entrance when the hall was already full. She would arrive at 9:15, enough time for him and Victoria to be completely comfortable in their roles as the perfect couple. On the night of the ball, as she got ready in her room in the West Wing, Emma felt a surprising calm. Martha helped her with the last details, tears in the housekeeper's eyes as she fastened the pearl necklace around her mistress's neck. "You look absolutely stunning," Martha whispered, adjusting the sapphire blue dress that hugged Emma's curves elegantly. "Show them who you really are," Emma looked at her reflection one last time. The shy teacher from Boston had given way to a woman who exuded confidence and dignity. Her red hair was elegantly tied into a low bun, a few loose strands framing her porcelain face. The dress, with its discreet yet sensual neckline, was a couture masterpiece that would make any Manhattan socialite green with envy. "It's time," she said, reaching for her clutch. "Martha, thank you for everything." As she walked down the back stairs of the mansion, where her private chauffeur was waiting for her, Emma thought about all the nights she spent alone, all the events from which she was excluded, all the times she had to hear Victoria's laughter echoing through the house. His heart pounded in his chest, not with fear, but with the certainty that he was doing the right thing. The journey to the Plaza Hotel was made in contemplative silence. The lights of Manhattan shone like earthly stars, silent witnesses of what was about to happen. Emma knew her entrance to the ball wouldn't just be an appearance. It would be a declaration of war against years of submission and shame. When the car stopped in front of the hotel, she took a deep breath. In a few minutes, she would face not only her husband and his lover, but the entire society that had rejected her without even knowing her. And this time, Emma Westfield wouldn't hide in the west wing of any mansion. The Plaza Hotel glowed like a jewel in the Manhattan night, its golden lights reflecting off the mirrored windows of neighboring skyscrapers. The ballroom was a spectacle of opulence, its crystal chandeliers spilling light onto the impeccably dressed guests who moved through the room like pieces in an elaborate game of social chess. Charles Westfield adjusted his bow tie as he watched Victoria Bennett charm a group of investors with her studiedly melodious laugh. She looked stunning in her gold Valentino gown, every movement calculated to maximize its effect on the carefully selected audience. She was exactly the kind of woman society expected to see next to a Westfield. "Charles, darling." Victoria glided over to him, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "The Richardsons have just arrived. They're eager to discuss that property in Aspen." He accepted the glass, his fingers deliberately brushing hers. "You're amazing, Victoria. I don't know what I would do without you. I'm your perfect partner, aren't I?" She smiled, her green eyes shining with a mixture of triumph and desire. "In every way." The comment made Charles think of Emma, alone in the west wing of the mansion. A pang of guilt hit him, quickly drowning himself in a sip of champagne. He loved Emma, or at least he once had. But love was not always enough in the world he lived in, where every gesture was scrutinized, every association measured in terms of social value. On the other side of town, a black Bentley glided silently through the streets of Manhattan. Emma sat in the back seat, her heart beating in a steady rhythm that seemed to tick away the seconds until her revenge. She watched the city lights through the window, remembering the exact moment she realized her marriage had turned into an elaborate lie. It had been 3 months ago, during a dinner at the mansion. Charles had insisted that she remain in his quarters, citing an important business meeting. But Emma, driven by a painful curiosity, had crept into the second-floor corridor. From there, he saw Charles and Victoria in the conservatory, very close together, their heads together over documents that were clearly not the real focus of their attention. "We're here, Mrs. Westfield." The driver's voice brought her back to the present. Emma took a deep breath, checking her reflection one last time in the compact mirror. Dark red lipstick contrasted perfectly with her fair skin, and sapphire earrings, a gift from Charles in happier times, glimmered in the light of the plaza's lobby. Inside the ballroom, Charles was getting closer and closer to Victoria, the champagne breaking down his last barriers of discretion. The soft music and the buzz of conversations created a perfect sound curtain for whispered confidences and touches that went beyond the boundaries of the property. "We should go to the terrace," Victoria suggested, her hand sliding up Charles's arm. "The air is perfect tonight." Charles agreed, guiding her through the French doors that led to the outside area. The view of Manhattan at night was breathtaking, but their eyes were fixed on each other. Victoria moved closer, eliminating the last space between them. "We don't have to pretend anymore, Charles," she murmured. "Everyone already sees us as a couple." At the exact moment their lips met, a collective murmur of surprise swept the room. Charles separated from Victoria abruptly, his eyes finding the figure that had just entered the room. Emma stood at the entrance to the ballroom, a sapphire-blue vision that made everyone present hold their breath. His bearing was regal, his presence magnetic. She advanced gracefully across the room, each step echoing like a hammer on the final nail in the coffin of her marriage. "Good evening, Charles." His voice was clear and firm, carrying to the farthest corners of the room. "I thought it was about time your wife attended one of these events." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria paled, her gold dress suddenly looking tacky next to Emma's natural elegance. Charles was frozen, his face a mask of shock and horror. "Emma," he managed finally, "what are you doing here?" "Doing what I should have done a long time ago," she replied, her voice carrying years of suppressed hurt. "Showing everyone who Charles Westfield really is." The guests began to whisper among themselves, pieces of the puzzle quickly falling into place. The mysterious wife who never showed up, the assistant who was always present, Charles's elusive behavior when it came to his personal life. Senator Catherine Walsh, one of the most respected matriarchs of Manhattan society, was the first to approach Emma. "My dear, it is a pleasure to finally meet you. Charles has been very selfish in keeping you hidden from us for so long." The comment, said with a razor-sharp smile, was a clear statement of which side society was choosing. One by one, the most influential women in the hall approached Emma, forming a protective circle around her, leaving Charles and Victoria isolated in their own misery. Emma maintained her composure, accepting each performance with grace and natural charm. His politeness and intelligence shined through in every carefully chosen word, every precisely measured gesture. She was proving to be exactly the kind of wife any prestigious family would want, not the shame Charles had so feared. As the night progressed, it became increasingly clear that Emma was not just a teacher from humble beginnings, but a woman of extraordinary strength who had endured years of humiliation in silence. Her revenge was not a blatant scandal, but a calculated display of dignity that exposed her husband's true nature. Charles watched helplessly as his carefully constructed world crumbled around him. Victoria had discreetly disappeared, taking with her the last illusions of a perfect life that he had worked so hard to maintain. The Westfield charity ball would long be remembered, not for the funds raised or the business deals struck, but as the night Emma Westfield emerged from the shadows and showed everyone that sometimes true class has nothing to do with lineage or a bank account. The New York Times headline the next morning couldn't have been clearer. "Westfield Scandal, Real Estate Heir Exposed at Charity Ball." The article, strategically positioned in the social section, detailed with surgical precision the events of the previous night, with particular attention to the surprising and elegant appearance of the hitherto reclusive Mrs. Westfield. Emma leafed through the newspaper in her suite at the Four Seasons, where she had stayed after leaving the Plaza Hotel. His phone kept buzzing with messages of support from people he barely knew, including several of the socialites who had witnessed his grand entrance. Senator Walsh, in particular, had sent an invitation to a private lunch that afternoon. "Mrs. Westfield?" Martha's voice rang through the phone. "Mr. Westfield is trying to find out where you are. He's already called 5 different hotels. Thank you for letting me know, Martha. Please continue to keep a low profile on my location." Emma paused. "How is he?" "Devastated would be the appropriate word. Miss Bennett didn't show up at the company today, and rumors are circulating like wildfire." The news provoked a complex mix of emotions in Emma. Part of her felt a bitter satisfaction in knowing that Charles was tasting the very poison of public humiliation. Another part, the one that still had memories of happy days in Boston, felt a pang of pain for him. In the Westfield Properties office, Charles stared out the 45th floor windows at the city. His secretary had just brought the 3rd cup of coffee and another stack of urgent messages, most of them from council members demanding an extraordinary meeting to discuss the previous night's incident. "Sir?" His secretary hesitated at the door. "Mr. Richardson is on the phone. He says he needs to discuss the Aspen deal, and mentions that his wife is interested in arranging lunch with Mrs. Westfield. Charles closed his eyes, feeling a headache coming on. In less than 12 hours, Emma had achieved what Victoria had tried for years, genuine acceptance from Manhattan's social elite. The irony of the situation was not lost on him. Meanwhile, at Le Bernardin restaurant, Senator Catherine Walsh was waiting for Emma for the promised lunch. The matriarch of New York society had immediately recognized in Emma something that Charles had failed to see: a potential ally with natural intelligence and grace. "My dear," the senator stood to greet Emma, "you have made more of an impact in one night than many attempt to make in decades." Emma smiled, accepting the warm hug. "Senator Walsh, I really appreciate your invitation. Catherine, please. After last night, I think we can dispense with the formalities." She gestured for the waiter to pour champagne. "You know, I always thought Charles's behavior towards his mysterious wife was strange. Now I understand why he kept her hidden. You are a threat to his control." The senator's words hit Emma hard. For years, she had interpreted Charles's behavior as shame at his humble origins, but perhaps there was something deeper: fear, afraid that she might dim his carefully cultivated light. "I didn't mean to cause a scene," Emma began, but Catherine interrupted her with an elegant gesture. "Honey, you didn't cause a scandal. You exposed one. There's a fundamental difference there. And, if I may say so, you did it with more class than anyone could have expected." The lunch went on for hours, with Catherine introducing Emma to several influential members of society who were, coincidentally, having lunch at the same restaurant. Each new performance was a small victory, a validation of the decision Emma had made the night before. Back in his office, Charles received an unexpected visit from his mentor and family friend, Robert Sterling. The 70-year-old man, who had known 3 generations of Westfields, sat heavily in the leather armchair. "You managed to do something your father would have considered impossible, Charles," Sterling commented, pouring himself a whiskey. "He managed to make society sympathize with an outsider at the expense of a Westfield." "Bob, I can explain." "Explain what? How did you hide a perfectly presentable wife for years while parading around with your assistant? How did you turn a potentially advantageous situation into a public relations disaster?" Sterling shook his head. "Your father must be turning over in his grave." The mention of his father made Charles cringe internally. Preston Westfield III had been an impeccable man in his public appearances, even if his private life was a minefield of closely guarded secrets. "What do you suggest I do?" Charles asked finally. "First, fire Victoria. Immediately. Second, find your wife and beg for forgiveness, publicly, if necessary. And third," Sterling stood up, adjusting his suit, "learn to recognize when you have a diamond in your hand before someone else does." Emma spent the rest of the afternoon fielding calls from people she had never met, but who now seemed desperate to make a connection. Among them, surprisingly, was Charles's mother, Eleanor Westfield, a woman who until then had barely exchanged 2 words with her daughter-in-law. "Emma, dear." Eleanor's voice sounded strangely emotional over the phone. "I'd really like to have tea with you tomorrow. There's a lot we need to talk about." As the sun set over Manhattan, Emma watched the city from her suite window, aware that her life had changed irrevocably. The power Charles so feared she had manifested itself not through scandal or petty revenge, but through the very authenticity he had tried to suppress. In his office, Charles held Victoria's resignation letter in his hands, delivered by email minutes before. The final words echoed in his mind. "Maybe you should have worried less about hiding your wife, and more about earning her." That night, as New York prepared for bed, 2 hearts beat in different rhythms. One in search of redemption, the other finally free to be who it always was. Eleanor Westfield waited anxiously in her Park Avenue apartment, watching the private elevator door with an anticipation she hadn't felt in years. Afternoon tea was impeccably served on Wedgwood china, a tradition that went back 3 generations of Westfield women. When Emma emerged from the elevator, Eleanor immediately noticed her resemblance to another woman who, decades ago, had also dared to challenge family conventions. "Welcome, my dear." Eleanor stood up to greet her daughter-in-law, noticing how Emma maintained the same elegant posture as the night before. "Please sit down." Emma watched her mother-in-law curiously. Eleanor Westfield had always been a distant, almost mythical figure, known for her charitable events and her quiet influence in Manhattan's most exclusive circles. Today, however, there was something different in his eyes, a vulnerability that Emma had never noticed before. "I imagine you're wondering why I invited you today," Eleanor began, pouring the tea with studied precision. "There is a story I need to tell you, one that Charles has never fully known." Eleanor removed an old photo album from a nearby drawer, its pages yellowed with age. "Before I became Eleanor Westfield, I was Eleanor McKinnon, an art teacher at a Brooklyn public school." Emma almost dropped her cup of tea. "Were you a teacher?" "Preston, too, Charles's father, also hid me for a while." Eleanor smiled sadly. "Until your grandmother, Charlotte Westfield, did something very similar to what you did last night." Meanwhile, at the Westfield Properties office, Charles was facing a stormy meeting with the board of directors. News of the scandal had affected the company's shares, and several prominent investors expressed concern about the stability of the leadership. "We need an immediate damage containment plan," said Richard Hayes, the council's longest-serving member. "Your personal life is directly affecting our business, Charles." "I already fired Victoria," Charles replied, running a hand through his messy hair. "What about Emma?" "Your wife," Hayes interrupted with a wry smile. "Ironically, she could be our salvation. Social media is full of positive comments about her. The modern Cinderella who took on the Manhattan elite is winning over audiences in a way no marketing campaign could." Back at Eleanor's apartment, Emma was absorbing her mother-in-law's surprising story. How Eleanor had turned her humble beginnings into an advantage, using her artistic sensibilities to revolutionize her family's charitable events and forge genuine connections with people that money couldn't buy. "True power is not in hiding who we are, Emma, but in turning our differences into strength," Eleanor explained, gently touching her daughter-in-law's hand. "Charles inherited his father's fear of losing control, but you, my dear, inherited my courage to be authentic." Emma's phone buzzed with a message from Senator Walsh. "Charity lunch tomorrow at the Metropolitan Museum. Your presence is essential. Bring Eleanor." Eleanor read the message over Emma's shoulder and smiled. "Catherine has always been a brilliant strategist. She knows that together we are stronger." "But Charles," Emma began. "Charles will need to learn the same lesson Preston did," Eleanor stated firmly. "That Westfield women are not trophies to be displayed or hidden. We are partners, equals, and often, we are the ones who save the family from itself." Later that afternoon, when Emma left Eleanor's apartment, she carried with her more than advice. She carried a legacy of elegant resistance and social transformation that had been quietly passed down through generations of Westfield women. Charles, receiving news of the charity lunch through his contacts, realized that he was losing not only his wife, but a powerful alliance between two women who could either strengthen or destroy the empire he fought to protect. That night, as Manhattan prepared for bed, 3 different reflections occupied 3 different minds. Emma was planning her next public appearance, now strengthened by Eleanor's unexpected support. Charles realized that his biggest mistake had not been hiding Emma, but underestimating the power of authenticity she possessed. And Eleanor, in her Park Avenue apartment, smiled to think that, at last, history was getting right through her daughter-in-law. Manhattan's social chessboard had been rearranged, and the pieces were moving in a complex dance of power, redemption, and transformation. The next move would be crucial, and all eyes in society were fixed on the Westfields, waiting to see how this story of love, betrayal, and rebirth would unfold. The Metropolitan Museum of Art exuded an aura of power and prestige on that sunny Thursday morning. Emma and Eleanor Westfield arrived together, their presence complementing each other perfectly. Emma wore a peach Chanel ensemble that Eleanor had insisted on borrowing. while the Westfield matriarch opted for a classic Dior in navy blue. Senator Catherine Walsh was waiting for them at the top of the stairs, her calculated smile masking her satisfaction at seeing her latest social move come to fruition. The charity lunch for the arts was just an excuse to officially present the new alliance that was being formed between 3 generations of influential women. "My dears," Catherine greeted them with air kisses, "you caused more of a stir by arriving together than any scandal could." Eleanor smiled, her arm linked with Emma's. Catherine has always known that true influence comes not from scandal, but from strategic unity. The Met's main hall had been transformed into an intimate, elegant setting, with round tables strategically placed to facilitate discreet conversations. The guest list was a who's who of New York's elite, each person in attendance representing a crucial piece in the social chess that was unfolding. "Emma, dear," Eleanor murmured as they were led to the head table, "notice how Catherine positioned each person. It's no coincidence that the editor-in-chief of the New York Times is on our right, and the president of the Carnegie Foundation is on our left." The lessons Emma received from Eleanor went far beyond social etiquette. Every gesture, every presentation, every word exchanged carried decades of experience in social navigation. The young teacher who previously felt out of place now absorbed every nuance with the same dedication she applied to her literature classes. Meanwhile, at Westfield Properties, Charles was facing a tumultuous morning. Photos of Emma and her mother arriving at the Met together were already circulating on social media, and her phone kept ringing with calls from journalists eager for a comment on the apparent alliance between her wife and her mother. Mr. Westfield, his new executive assistant, a middle-aged woman chosen specifically for her discretion and professionalism, entered his office. "You have a call from Senator Walsh on line 1. Charles closed his eyes for a moment, preparing himself. Catherine Walsh was not known for making social connections. Each contact had a specific purpose. "Catherine, what a pleasant surprise." He tried to keep his tone light. "Charles, I'll be direct." The senator's voice cut through any pretense of pleasantries. "Your wife and mother are rewriting the Westfield narrative in a way that neither you nor your father ever could. You can fight it and lose, or accept it and benefit. The choice is yours." At the Met, Emma found herself at the center of a surprising transformation. Each person who approached discovered not only an elegant, well-educated woman, but someone with reasoned opinions about art, literature, and education. His passion for teaching and his vision for how philanthropy could revolutionize the educational system captivated even the most skeptical. "You know, Emma," Eleanor commented during a calmer moment, "when I married Preston, I faced challenges similar to yours. But I've learned that our true strength lies not in conforming to what is expected of us, but in transforming those expectations." Catherine, watching the interaction between the two women, smiled in satisfaction. "Eleanor, you should tell Emma about the art education program you implemented in the 80s. I'm sure she would have brilliant ideas for a modern version." The conversation naturally flowed into social projects and collaboration possibilities. Emma, with her experience in public education, offered a unique perspective that perfectly complemented the Westfield's traditional philanthropic vision. "Imagine," Emma perked up, her eyes shining with enthusiasm, "a program that combines the influence of the Westfield family with truly transformative educational initiatives, not just donations, but active involvement in the community." The idea captured the attention of everyone at the table. Eleanor exchanged a meaningful look with Catherine, both recognizing the potential not only of the project, but how it could redefine the Westfield legacy. Charles, unknowingly, was about to discover that his wife wasn't just conquering society. She was revolutionizing the way the Westfield family would be viewed for generations to come. At the end of lunch, as the guests said their goodbyes, Catherine pulled Emma and Eleanor into a discreet corner. "My dears, you have created more positive impact in 2 days than some families achieve in decades. Now," she smiled slyly, "let's discuss how to use that influence to really make a difference." Emma looked at Eleanor, who nodded encouragingly. In that moment, she understood that she had found not just allies, but mentors, who would help her transform her humiliation into a greater purpose. The afternoon sun bathed Fifth Avenue as Emma and Eleanor left the Met, their shadows stretching across the sidewalk as an omen of the changes to come. The most valuable lesson Emma learned that day was not about etiquette or social influence, but about how true power comes from authenticity combined with wisdom. "Emma," Eleanor said softly as they waited for their cars, "you're not just changing your story or Charles's. You're redefining what it means to be a Westfield." The words hung in the air like a promise, a new chapter unfolding not just for Emma, but for an entire dynasty that belatedly discovered that its true strength lay in the women it had tried to silence for so long. Charles Westfield's office seemed smaller that morning. The glass walls that once made him feel powerful now suffocated him. At the boardroom table, the financial reports showed a surprising reality. Westfield Properties shares had risen 3% since the prom incident, boosted by the positive coverage Emma and Eleanor were receiving in the media. "Social media is calling this the Westfield effect," explained Marcus Chen, the new director of marketing, sliding a folder across the glass table. "The story of a teacher who challenged the social elite is resonating with audiences in ways we couldn't have planned better." Charles flipped through the report, his eyes lingering on headlines that highlighted not his real estate ventures, but the social impact his wife and mother were having. The educational project that Emma had proposed at the Met was generating interest from investors who would not normally approach Westfield Properties. "We need a new approach," Marcus continued, sensing the vulnerability in his boss. "The public wants authenticity, not perfection. And your wife, sir, embodies just that." Meanwhile, in a discreet cafe on the Upper East Side, Emma met with Rebecca Hamilton, an influential editor at the New York Times. The location had been strategically chosen by Eleanor, intimate enough for a heart-to-heart, but public enough to be seen. "Your story is fascinating, Emma," Rebecca commented, her digital notebook capturing every word. "A teacher who turned humiliation into empowerment and is now using her new position to bring about real change in the education system." Emma adjusted her coffee cup, choosing her words carefully. "I believe with privilege comes responsibility. The Westfield name can open doors, but what we do after we walk through them is what really matters." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Eleanor, who joined them with the calculated grace of decades of social practice. "Rebecca, dear, I see Emma is already telling you about our educational initiative." "It's an incredible story," Rebecca replied, her eyes lighting up at the prospect of an exclusive story. "The Westfield's transformation from real estate tycoons to education revolutionaries." At Westfield Properties, Charles watched from his office window as the city continued its frenetic pace below. His phone buzzed with a message from Robert Sterling. "Time to swallow your pride, son. Your wife and mother are saving your legacy." The truth in Sterling's words was undeniable. In just 1 week, Emma had accomplished what generations of public relations consultants had failed to do: humanize the Westfield image. Her authenticity, combined with Eleanor's social experience, was creating a narrative that resonated with people from all walks of life. "Sir," his assistant interrupted his thoughts, "Senator Walsh is on line 1. She says it's about the new education bill." Charles hesitated before answering. Catherine Walsh had been clear in their last conversation. It was time to choose a side. "Catherine, what a pleasant surprise." "Charles, I'll be direct as always." The senator's voice was firm. "Your wife and mother have come up with a revolutionary proposal to transform underutilized Westfield Properties into community educational centers. It's brilliant, innovative, and exactly the kind of project that could redefine your legacy. The question is, will you keep fighting the inevitable, or will you join them?" At the cafe, Emma and Eleanor were finishing their interview with Rebecca. The article would be published on Sunday, coinciding with the official announcement of the Westfield Education Initiative. The timing wasn't coincidental. It was yet another lesson Emma was learning about the power of controlled storytelling. "Remember, darling," Eleanor whispered as Rebecca said goodbye, "in our position, every move is watched. Every word is analyzed. But that doesn't mean we need to be any less authentic, just more strategic. Emma nodded, absorbing yet another lesson from her unexpected mentor. The transformation from the shy teacher who hid in the West Wing into a force to be reckoned with wasn't just about revenge or redemption. It was about finding her true voice and using it to make a difference. Eleanor, Emma hesitated. Do you think Charles will understand eventually? The Westfields' matriarch smiled knowingly. My son has always been more like his father than I care to admit. But just as Preston eventually learned to value my contributions, Charles will. Sometimes love needs a reality check to grow. That night, as Manhattan prepared for bed, 3 people contemplated the future of the Westfields from different perspectives. Emma, in her room at the Four Seasons, finalizing the details of the educational project that could transform lives. Eleanor, in her apartment on Park Avenue, organized her network of contacts to launch the initiative. And Charles, still in his office, stared at a photograph of his wedding to Emma, realizing that perhaps his biggest mistake had not been hiding her, but trying to change the essence of what made her special. Power was changing hands in the Westfield dynasty, not through scandal or confrontation, but through the quiet strength of women who knew exactly who they were and what they wanted to achieve. The question that hung in the air was, would Charles be wise enough to recognize that his redemption lay in accepting this change? The morning sun illuminated the rooftop of the Empire State Building, where Charles Westfield had requested a private meeting with Robert Sterling. The family's mentor watched the city below as he awaited his protege, reflecting on how the most powerful dynasties were often transformed not by their fortunes, but by their women. Bob, Charles arrived, looking tired from sleepless nights. Thank you for seeing me so early. You look terrible, Sterling commented bluntly, gesturing for Charles to sit down. Although your wife has never looked better, I saw her pictures at the Met yesterday. Charles passed his hand over his face, a gesture that betrayed his emotional exhaustion. That's what we need to talk about. The Westfield educational initiative that Emma and my mom are planning. I need your honest opinion. Sterling poured 2 coffees, a ritual that had witnessed countless corporate decisions over the decades. Your wife managed to do in 1 week what your consultants have been trying to do for years. Humanize Westfield. The question is, are you ready to accept that your biggest mistake was trying to change something that was already extraordinary? Meanwhile, at the Four Seasons, Emma received an unexpected visitor. Martha, the housekeeper, had brought an antique box that she had found in the attic of the Westfield mansion. Ma'am, I found this while organizing some old belongings, Martha explained, placing the box on the table. I thought you might like to see it. Inside the box, Emma found photos and newspaper clippings yellowed with age. They were records of Eleanor's early years as wife of Preston Westfield II, images that told a story surprisingly similar to her own. Martha, that's... Emma picked up a particular photo that showed a young Eleanor teaching art to children at a community center. Yes, ma'am. Mistress Eleanor continued her work as a teacher secretly for years, even after her marriage. Mr. Preston only found out when the project became such a success that it was impossible to ignore. In her office at Westfield Properties, Victoria Bennett was making her final appearance to clear her desk. The gossip in the hallways fell silent as she passed, carrying a box of her belongings. Her reign as almost Mrs. Westfield had ended not with a bang, but with a whisper. Miss Bennett, Charles's new assistant intercepted her. There are reporters in the lobby. They would like a statement regarding your departure. Victoria adjusted her posture, years of social training masking her humiliation. Tell them that Westfield Properties and I have decided to go our separate ways. No further comment. At the New York Times headquarters, Rebecca Hamilton was finishing her article about Emma and the Westfield's transformation. The working title flashed on the screen. From the classroom to the C-suite. How a teacher is revolutionizing a real estate dynasty. Eleanor, reviewing a preview of the article on her iPad, smiled approvingly. The story wasn't just about Emma or the Westfields. It was about how authenticity could transform even the most traditional institutions. Catherine, Eleanor spoke on the phone with Senator Walsh. I think it's time for us to take the next step. Charles needs a push in the right direction. Back at the Empire State Building, Sterling was handing Charles a briefcase that would change everything. That's what your father never told you about your mother. About how the Westfield Empire nearly collapsed in the 80s, and how it was her art education program that saved not only the family's reputation, but also its finances. Charles opened the folder with shaking hands, finding documents that told a very different story than the one his father had shared. Eleanor hadn't just been a trophy wife. She'd been the silent architect of one of the greatest transformations in Westfield history. Why hasn't anyone ever told me this? Charles questioned, his voice cracking. Because your father, like you, was afraid of being overshadowed by an extraordinary woman, Sterling responded, with the cruel honesty that only decades of friendship allowed. And look where that got you. At the Four Seasons, Emma organized a video conference with Manhattan public school principals. His project wasn't just a public relations stunt. It was a personal mission born of years of experience in overcrowded classrooms and scarce resources. Imagine, she explained to the screen full of attentive faces, educational centers on underutilized Westfield properties, offering after-school programs, tutoring, and support for working families. It's not charity, it's investment in our community. Eleanor, who was discreetly watching the performance from the corner of the room, felt a deep sense of pride. Emma wasn't just following in their footsteps, she was creating her own path, one that could redefine not just Westfield, but the role of corporations in society. Charles, leaving the Empire State Building with Sterling's briefcase under his arm, made a decision. He would no longer be the man his father expected him to be. He would be the man Emma always knew he could be. The city pulsed with its own stories as 3 generations of Westfield transformation converged on a defining moment. Emma, preparing to launch her initiative, Eleanor, weaving the connections necessary for her success, and Charles, finally understanding that sometimes you have to lose everything to find your true strength. The sun set over Manhattan, painting the skyscrapers with shades of gold and pink, as a new era of Westfield dawned. An era built not on appearances and expectations, but on authenticity and purpose. The Manhattan Club, a bastion of New York's elite since 1865, rarely witnessed unplanned encounters among its members. However, on that Thursday afternoon, fate, or perhaps Eleanor Westfield's cunning manipulation, brought Charles and Emma face to face for the first time since the ball. Emma was sitting at one of the club's private tables, discussing the final details of the Westfield Education Initiative with Catherine Walsh when Charles entered the main room. The moment of mutual recognition was palpable, sending ripples of tension through the refined environment. Well, Catherine commented, watching the scene unfold. Looks like we're in for a more interesting lunch than planned. Emma maintained her composure even though her heart was pounding under her navy Carolina Herrera dress. The last few weeks had transformed the shy teacher into a woman who knew exactly her worth, but facing Charles still aroused complex emotions. Charles, she greeted him with studied calm as he approached the table. What a surprise to find you here. Emma, he replied, his voice betraying a mixture of anxiety and wonder. Senator Walsh. He hesitated, clearly unsure how to proceed. Catherine, demonstrating the social skills that had made her legendary in Manhattan, smiled graciously. Charles, why don't you join us? We were just discussing the future of Westfield. The silence that followed was filled with the soft clink of silver cutlery and hushed conversations at neighboring tables. Charles, after a moment's hesitation, accepted the invitation. I read the article in the Times, he began, sitting down. It's impressive what you're accomplishing, Emma. What are we accomplishing? She corrected softly. After all, I'm still a Westfield, aren't I? The irony in his voice did not go unnoticed. Charles observed his wife with new eyes, noting how she had blossomed since emerging from the shadows of the West Wing. The fear that had once consumed him, that she might bring shame to the Westfield name, now seemed ridiculously unfounded. Emma, he began again, but was interrupted by the arrival of Eleanor, who joined the table with the timed precision of a social conductor. "Ah, what a lovely meeting," Eleanor commented, as if she hadn't orchestrated every detail of the meeting. "Charles, honey, have you heard about the new education center we have planned for the building in Brooklyn?" The conversation flowed into professional territory, with Emma outlining her vision for transforming underutilized Westfield properties into innovative educational spaces. His knowledge of the educational system, combined with a newfound understanding of the corporate world, impressed even Charles. The return on investment wouldn't just be financial, Emma explained, her eyes shining with passion. Imagine the social impact, the change in public perception of Westfield, the real transformation in the lives of the communities. Charles watched, fascinated, as his wife commanded the table's attention. This was not the woman he had tried to hide. This was a force of nature that he should have celebrated from the beginning. "I have a confession to make," he said suddenly, interrupting a discussion about budgets. "Sterling showed me the files on her mother's art education program in the 80s. Eleanor set down her glass of wine, her eyes meeting her son's. "So you finally know." "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Charles asked, the hurt evident in his voice. "Because your father insisted that you needed to forge your own path without the shadow of my success," Eleanor replied with cutting honesty. "But look where that fear of being overshadowed by strong women has gotten you, Charles." Emma watched the interaction between mother and son with a new understanding. Charles's behavior wasn't just about shame about his origins. It was about a legacy of Westfield men who feared the power of the women they chose as partners. "I'm not my father," Charles declared, his voice firm for the first time that afternoon. "And I don't want to make the same mistakes." "Prove it," Emma challenged softly. "Not with words, Charles, but with actions." Catherine Walsh watched the family drama unfold with the interest of someone who deeply understood the power of social dynamics. "The Westfields have always been known for their properties," she commented. "Maybe it's time for them to be known for their social legacy." Lunch continued, tensions gradually dissolving into a productive discussion about the future. Charles, for the first time, was truly listening, not just to Emma, but also to his mother's decades of accumulated wisdom. When the meal ended, Eleanor and Catherine strategically withdrew, leaving Charles and Emma alone at the table. "I miss you," he admitted finally, the words coming out like a painful confession. "I miss the person I was when I was with you in Boston, before I let fear and pride dictate my actions." Emma studied the face of the man she had loved so much, and who, despite everything, still loved. "That Charles is still there," she replied softly. "The question is he strong enough to overcome his fear of being who he really is?" Leaving the Manhattan Club that afternoon, 3 different paths appeared on the horizon, one of redemption, one of transformation, and one of reconciliation. The question hanging in the air was whether Charles Westfield was really ready to embark on them all. News of the Manhattan Club meeting quickly circulated through New York's corridors of power. The meeting between Charles and Emma Westfield, masterfully orchestrated by Eleanor, had become the talk of the city's most exclusive social circles. But while society speculated about imminent reconciliation or divorce, a deeper transformation was taking place behind the scenes. The morning after the meeting, Charles was in his office reviewing documents Sterling had shared about his mother's art education program. Each page revealed a story of courage and vision that had been deliberately hidden from him. The photographs showed Eleanor, young and radiant, opening cultural centers in deprived neighborhoods, her actions generating positive headlines that had saved Westfield's reputation during a financial crisis in the 1980s. "Sir," his assistant interrupted his thoughts, "the development team is ready for the Education Initiative presentation." Charles adjusted his tie and headed to the conference room, where he found not only his usual team, but also Emma, sitting at the head of the table with a confidence that surprised him. She wore a charcoal gray business suit that contrasted elegantly with her red hair, now tied back in a professional bun. "Good morning, everyone," Emma began, her firm voice echoing through the room. Today we will discuss how we can transform underutilized properties into centers of educational excellence. Over the next hour, Charles watched in fascination as his wife presented a detailed plan that combined educational innovation with sound real estate strategy. She had done her homework, studying not only the available properties, but also the specific needs of each community. The first pilot center will be in Brooklyn, Emma explained, projecting architectural plans onto the screen. The former warehouse on Water Street is perfect. Central location, ample space, and a community that really needs this type of resource. The executives present, initially skeptical, began furiously taking notes. Emma's plan was not only socially responsible, it was financially viable, with return on investment projections that would make any shareholder smile. "Impressive," Charles commented when the performance ended. "You really thought of everything." Emma put away her documents with studied calm. "I've learned a lot from watching behind the scenes all these years, Charles. Sometimes the best view comes from those in the shadows." The comment hit Charles like a well-aimed arrow. How many other things had he lost by keeping Emma hidden? How many wasted opportunities because you were too concerned about appearances? Meanwhile, Eleanor conducted her own form of social diplomacy at Le Bernardin, lunching with a select group of Manhattan influencers. Victoria Bennett, who had tried unsuccessfully to get an invitation to this circle for years, watched from afar, sitting alone at a table in the corner of the restaurant. "Eleanor," one of the socialites commented, "your daughter-in-law is simply brilliant. Who would have thought that a public school teacher would have such a vision for corporate philanthropy?" "The best diamonds, dear," Eleanor replied with a knowing smile, "are often found in the most unlikely places." Back at the Westfield Properties office, Emma was preparing to leave when Charles intercepted her in the hallway. "Can we talk? In private?" She followed him to his office, noting how different the space felt now, less intimidating, perhaps because she herself had changed. Charles closed the door and turned to face her, his eyes revealing a vulnerability she rarely saw. "I read all the files on my mother's work," he began, "and I realized that I made the same mistake as my father. I let fear control my decisions." Emma sat gracefully in one of the leather armchairs. "What kind of fear, Charles?" "Afraid that I wouldn't be enough on my own. Afraid that if you shined too bright, people would see through the facade I'd built." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she recognized from her days in Boston. "Afraid to admit that I fell in love with you precisely because of your authenticity, something I later tried to suppress." The silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken hurt and stifled hopes. Emma studied the man in front of her, no longer the arrogant heir who had hidden her in the West Wing, but someone struggling to find his own path to redemption. "You know what's ironic?" she finally spoke. "While you tried to mold me to fit into your world, I was learning to navigate it in my own way. Every party I watched from the shadows, every conversation I overheard in the hallways, it all became a lesson in power and influence." Charles came over, sitting in the armchair next to her. "And now you master this game better than me." "It's not a game, Charles. It's about creating real impact, about using privilege to create meaningful change." Emma stood up, smoothing down her blazer. "The question is, are you ready to be a partner in this change? Or are you going to remain stuck with your father's ghosts?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities and unspoken promises. Charles watched his wife walk to the door, her posture exuding a confidence that was both natural and hard-won. "Emma," he called as she was about to leave, "the center in Brooklyn, when is it opening?" "Next Friday," she replied, half turning away. "I'll be there like Emma Westfield, not hidden in the shadows." "I'll be there too," Charles declared, "as your partner, if you still accept me in that role." A small smile played on Emma's lips as she left the office, leaving Charles with the knowledge that the real work of rebuilding, of his marriage, his family, and his legacy, was just beginning. The opening of the Westfield Educational Center in Brooklyn was quickly approaching, and with it, an energy of change permeated not only the company, but also the relationships that had been strained in recent months. Emma, now based in her own office at the Westfield Properties headquarters, coordinated the final preparations with the same dedication she used to apply to her lesson plans. "The pre-registration numbers are impressive," Marcus Chen commented during a morning meeting. "We have more than 200 families interested in after-school programs, and the list continues to grow." Emma smiled, pleased with the progress. The former warehouse on Water Street had been transformed into a modern and welcoming space, with classrooms equipped with the latest technology, a community library, and even a small theater for student performances. Every detail reflected his vision of inclusive and transformative education. Meanwhile, Charles faced his own journey of transformation. The afternoon before the inauguration, he surprised his team by requesting a meeting with teachers from the public system who would be partners in the project. "We need to understand the real needs of the community," he explained to his perplexed assistant. "We can't simply impose our vision without listening to those on the front lines." The news of this change of approach quickly reached Eleanor, who watched her son's progress with a mixture of pride and caution. Over tea with Catherine Walsh in her Park Avenue apartment, she shared her impressions. "Charles is finally learning the lesson that Preston could never fully absorb," Eleanor commented, pouring more tea into Wedgwood china cups. "True leadership is not about control, but about collaboration." Catherine nodded, her keen eyes assessing the situation. "And Emma? How is she dealing with this transformation?" "With grace and wisdom," Eleanor replied. "She's not just embracing change. She's actively shaping Westfield's future in ways none of us could have predicted." On the eve of the opening, Emma found some quiet time in her new office. The walls, once decorated with generic corporate art, now displayed work by local Brooklyn artists and photographs of successful educational projects around the world. It was a space that reflected their vision, a bridge between the corporate world of Westfield and the reality of the communities they aimed to serve. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Charles was standing in the doorway, holding a folder and looking slightly nervous. "Can I come in?" he asked, a humility in his voice that still sounded strange to Emma's ears. "Of course," she replied, indicating the chair in front of her. "How was the meeting with the teachers?" Charles sat down, placing the folder on the table. "Enlightening, and a little humbling, to be honest. They've been struggling with limited resources for so long, making miracles with next to nothing, while we—" He gestured vaguely toward the luxurious corporate building. Emma watched her husband with interest. The man who once worried obsessively about appearances now seemed genuinely touched by the reality of those he served. "I brought something for you to see," Charles continued, opening the folder. "These are some ideas I developed based on feedback from teachers. I thought we could incorporate some of them into the project." As they reviewed the proposals together, Emma noticed how Charles had really listened, not just heard, but truly absorbed the needs and suggestions of the community. His notes revealed a deeper understanding of the impact the center could have. "That's impressive," Emma admitted, flipping through the detailed pages. "You really took the time to understand the project." "I learned from the best," Charles replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that reminded Emma of her first days in Boston. "You always saw beyond appearances. You always saw the potential in people and situations. It just took me a long time to realize that." The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Martha, who now acted as the project's administrative coordinator. "Ms. Westfield, the vendors for tomorrow's ceremony need some final confirmations." Emma noticed how Charles didn't flinch when he heard Martha address her formally, another small sign of change. "Thanks, Martha. I'll be there in a moment." When Martha left, Charles stood up but hesitated before leaving. "Emma, about tomorrow. I thought maybe we could arrive together, as partners." The proposal hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. It wasn't just about attending an event together. It was a public declaration of a new dynamic in their relationship. "That would be appropriate," Emma replied carefully. "After all, this project is as much yours as it is mine now." Charles nodded, understanding that she was offering a professional, if not yet completely personal, olive branch. It was a start, and he was learning to value small improvements. Night fell over New York, and as the city's lights began to shine, 3 generations of Westfielders prepared for a moment that could redefine not only their family legacy, but also their collective future. Emma, in her suite at the Four Seasons, was reviewing her inauguration speech. Charles, in his Upper East Side apartment, mentally rehearsed how he would present his wife, not as a secret to be hidden, but as a transformative force. And Eleanor, watching the city from her balcony, smiled when she thought about how sometimes everything needs to fall apart to be rebuilt in a stronger and truer way. The morning of the opening of the Westfield Educational Center dawned with a palpable energy in the Brooklyn air. The former warehouse on Water Street, now transformed into an impressive educational center, stood out against the autumn sky with its restored facade and new gold sign shining in the morning light. Emma adjusted her navy blue Diane von Furstenberg dress as she watched the final preparations through the window of her temporary downtown office. The team moved with rehearsed precision, positioning chairs, checking sound equipment, and adjusting tracks that heralded the new beginning not just for the community, but for Westfield itself. "Everything's perfect," Martha commented, entering the room with a cup of tea. "Mr. Charles just arrived. He's in the main lobby." Emma felt her heart speed up slightly. Since their conversation in the office, they had maintained a cordial professional dynamic, but today would be different. Today, they would publicly present themselves as equal partners for the first time. "How is he?" Emma asked, applying one last swipe of lipstick. "Nervous," Martha replied with a small smile. "I've never seen him check his tie so much before." In the main lobby, Charles was talking to Robert Sterling, who had arrived early to offer moral support. The mentor observed with approval the changes evident in his protégé, from his more relaxed posture to the way he genuinely interacted with the center's staff. "You did a good job here, Charles," Sterling commented, taking in the impressive space. "Your father would never have imagined Westfield Properties taking this direction, but sometimes the best changes are the most unexpected." Charles adjusted his tie for the 10th time. "Emma made it happen. I just finally learned not to get in the way." "You did more than that," a familiar voice interjected. Eleanor Westfield approached, elegant in a coral Chanel ensemble. "You learned to be a partner, not just an obstacle." The arrival of the first guests interrupted the family conversation. Senator Walsh led a group of local politicians and philanthropists as public school principals and community leaders began to fill the lobby. The contrast between the worlds that Emma had fought so hard to unite was finally materializing. "Charles," Emma called softly, approaching the group. Her husband turned, and for a moment, they were both transported back to that library in Boston where it all began. "You look stunning," he said sincerely, offering his arm. "Ready to make history?" Emma accepted the gesture, noticing the approving looks from the guests. "Always have been. I was just waiting for you to be ready too." The ribbon-cutting ceremony was a triumph of planning and purpose. Emma and Charles took the stage together, their natural synchronicity highlighting months of work together and years of shared history. Charles's opening speech surprised everyone with its honesty and vulnerability. For a long time, the Westfields were only concerned with building buildings. He began, his voice firm. "Today, thanks to the vision and determination of my wife, Emma, we are learning to build communities." Emma watched her husband with a new eye as he continued, recognizing in him not only the man she had fallen in love with in Boston, but also someone who had finally found his own voice and purpose. When it was her turn to speak, Emma captured the audience's attention with the same mix of passion and pragmatism that characterized her. "This center is not just a renovated building," she declared. "It's a symbol of transformation, not just for this community, but for all of us who have learned that true change begins when we tear down the walls that separate us." The afternoon progressed with tours of the center, presentations by local students, and lively conversations between members of the business elite and public system educators. Eleanor watched everything with satisfaction, noticing how her daughter-in-law easily navigated between the different groups, building bridges where only walls previously existed. "Impressive, isn't it?" Catherine Walsh commented, joining Eleanor. "How she managed to turn a social scandal into an educational revolution." "Emma always had that ability," Eleanor replied. "We just needed to give her space to shine." At the end of the day, as the last guests left and the team began to organize the space for the first official day of activities, Charles found Emma in her office. She was standing at the window, watching the families still chatting animatedly in the center's courtyard. "We did it," he said softly, standing next to her. "Yes," Emma replied, turning to face him. "But this is just the beginning, isn't it?" Charles nodded, understanding that she wasn't just talking about the education center, but about everything: their marriage, their partnership, their future together. "I have some ideas for other centers," he commented, "if you're interested in hearing them." Emma's smile lit up her face. "I've always been interested in your ideas, Charles. You just had to be ready to share them." As the sun set over Brooklyn, casting golden shadows across the downtown windows, the Westfield couple stood side by side, finally united not just by name or appearance, but by a shared purpose and a deeper understanding of what it meant to be truly partners. With the success of the opening of the Westfield Education Center still reverberating through the city, Emma found herself in a position she had never imagined when she arrived in New York, at the center of a quiet revolution that was transforming not only a business dynasty, but also the city's very social fabric. A week after the center opened, she received an unexpected call from Rebecca Hamilton of the New York Times. "Emma, I need to do a follow-up story. The center's impact is already exceeding all expectations." It was true. Registration for educational programs had doubled, and other neighborhoods were beginning to show interest in similar projects. But it wasn't just professional success that occupied Emma's thoughts. It was the subtle shift in her dynamic with Charles. "Mrs. Westfield?" Martha interrupted her thoughts, entering her office with an antique box. "I found this during the last cleaning of the west wing of the mansion. I thought you might like to see it." The box contained letters, dozens of them, exchanged between Preston Westfield II and Eleanor during the early years of their marriage. Emma picked one up carefully, recognizing her mother-in-law's elegant handwriting. "My dear Preston," she read in a low voice, "I know you fear that my work in art education might tarnish the Westfield name, but I ask that you trust me. Sometimes the greatest legacy we can leave is not the one we build in steel and concrete, but the one we plant in people's hearts." Eleanor's words, written decades ago, resonated with startling truth in the present. Emma put the letter away carefully when she heard familiar footsteps approaching. "I thought I'd find you here," Charles said, stopping at the door. He seemed different the last few days, more relaxed, more present. "I have something to show you." He led her to his car, and together they drove through Manhattan until they arrived at a historic building in Greenwich Village. "This building has been in the family for generations," Charles explained as they walked up the stairs. "I never really knew what to do with it, but after the success in Brooklyn..." Emma took in the expansive space with its elegant arches and tall windows. "It's perfect for an arts center," she finished her thought. "Exactly what my mother said when I showed it to her." Charles smiled. "In fact, this is where she took her first art lessons, before my father convinced her to stop." The moment carried significant weight. It wasn't just about a new project, but about Charles finally embracing his family's full legacy, including the parts his father had tried to suppress. "Why are you showing me this now?" Emma asked softly. Charles approached one of the windows, watching the activity on the street below. "Because I finally understand something you've always known, that true strength comes not from controlling narratives, but from allowing them to unfold naturally." That evening, during an intimate dinner at Eleanor's penthouse, 3 generations of Westfield transformation gathered to discuss the future. Catherine Walsh was also present, her discerning eye observing the family dynamics with interest. "The Art Center in Greenwich Village," Eleanor commented, pouring herself some wine, "is an interesting choice, Charles. Are you sure you're ready to fully embrace the family's artistic legacy? Charles exchanged a look with Emma before responding. Actually, I was thinking about naming it after you, Mom. The Eleanor Westfield Art Center. The silence that followed was charged with emotion. Eleanor set down her glass, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Your father would never have allowed that. I'm not my father, Charles replied simply, and it's high time we honor all parts of our history. Catherine Walsh watched the scene with satisfaction. You know, Eleanor, when you began your work in art education in the 1980s, many said it would be the end of the Westfields. Now look where we are. Your daughter-in-law expanding your legacy in ways no one could have predicted. Emma absorbed the conversation, realizing how the stories of 3 generations of Westfield women intertwined in a complex pattern of challenge, resistance, and transformation. Victoria Bennett had been just a symptom of a larger problem. Westfield men's generational fear of being overshadowed by extraordinary women. The true power of the Westfields, Eleanor declared, raising her glass in a toast, has always been in the women the men of the family chose, even when they tried to hide it from us. Charles accepted the comment with a humility that would have been unthinkable a few months ago. To transformation, he proposed, raising his own glass, and to finally learn the lessons that were in front of us all along. As the night progressed and the conversation flowed, Emma realized that she was witnessing not just a family reconciliation, but the birth of a new era for the Westfields. An era where strength did not mean control, where legacy was not just measured in square meters, and where the shadows of the West Wing finally gave way to the light of full recognition. The first rays of November sun found Emma in her new office at the Eleanor Westfield Art Center, still under renovation. She watched workers installing nameplates in classrooms as she reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past few months. The New York Times had published an extensive report that morning on the Westfield's transformation, highlighting how a public school teacher had revolutionized one of Manhattan's biggest real estate dynasties. Thoughtful so soon? Charles's voice surprised her. He was standing in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee from the little Italian cafe they used to frequent on their first dates in Boston. Just taking it all in, Emma replied, accepting the coffee. Sometimes it feels surreal how we got here. Charles approached the window, watching Greenwich Village awaken. I found something interesting in the old company files last night, he commented, removing a yellowed envelope from his inside jacket pocket. It's a letter from my grandfather to my grandmother Charlotte, written shortly before he passed away. Emma approached, curious. The letter, dated 1975, revealed a side of the Westfields that Charles had never known. My dear Charlotte, he read aloud, as I watch our son Preston forge his own path, I fear he has inherited only half the lesson I tried to teach. He learned about business and power, but has forgotten that our true strength has always come from the extraordinary women we choose as partners. The silence that followed was filled by the distant sound of New York waking up. Emma gently touched Charles's arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. Your grandfather seems to have been a wise man. Wiser than your son or grandson, Charles admitted with a sad smile. But it's never too late to learn, right? The day unfolded in a series of meetings and decisions about the new center. Eleanor arrived around noon, bringing with her Catherine Walsh and a group of the city's respected art curators. The contrast between Westfield's traditional corporate environment and the creative energy of the developing arts center was palpable. It's fascinating to see how you are integrating elements of the past with a modern vision, commented one of the curators, admiring the original 19th century arches that had been preserved in the renovation. Eleanor watched with pride as Emma and Charles presented the project together, their voices naturally complementing each other as they described their vision for the space. There was no longer tension or competition between them, just a genuine partnership built on mutual respect and understanding. You know, Catherine whispered to Eleanor during a calmer moment, when you told me about your plan to use the ball scandal to force change, I confess I had my doubts. But look at them now. Eleanor smiled, remembering nights of planning with Emma at the Four Seasons, preparing each move like an elaborate game of chess. Sometimes we need to completely break something to build it back stronger. In the afternoon, Emma received an unexpected visitor. Victoria Bennett stood in the doorway of her office, visibly uncomfortable but determined. "Can I come in?" Emma indicated the chair in front of her, keeping her expression neutral. Victoria had lost some of her previous social luster. Her designer outfit was still impeccable, but there was a new humility in her posture. "I came to apologize," Victoria began, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "Not just for the obvious, but for not recognizing your value from the beginning. You turned Westfield into something I could never achieve, even with all my social pedigree." "I didn't come to transform the Westfields, Victoria," Emma replied calmly. "I came to be myself. The transformation was just a natural consequence of that." When Victoria left, Charles entered, having witnessed the meeting from afar. "You're a better person than I'll ever be," he commented, approaching Emma. "It's not about being better or worse, Charles. It's about being authentic." Emma stood up, organizing some documents on her desk. "Do you remember that first night in Boston, when you walked into the library looking for shelter from the rain?" Charles smiled at the memory. "You were teaching an evening literature class for adults, talking about Jane Austen with such enthusiasm that it made me want to learn all about Pride and Prejudice. And you sat in the back row trying to go unnoticed in your soaked Armani suit," Emma added, laughing softly. "That night, you weren't the Westfield heir. You were just a man interested in classical literature." The moment was interrupted by Martha's arrival with the latest reports from the Brooklyn Education Center. The numbers were impressive. The impact on the community was already measurable after just a few weeks of operation. "The council has scheduled a meeting for tomorrow," Charles reported, leafing through the reports. "They want to discuss expanding the program to other neighborhoods." Emma nodded, already familiar with the nuances of Westfield corporate politics. "And how do you feel about that?" "Honestly?" Charles stared at her with an intensity that was reminiscent of their first days together. "For the first time in my life, I feel like we are building something that goes beyond square feet and market value. We are creating a real legacy." The sun was beginning to set over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Emma and Charles stood in silence for a moment, watching the city through the historic windows of what would soon be the Eleanor Westfield Arts Center. It wasn't just a building being renovated, but a symbol of how love, when true, has the power to transform not just two people, but entire generations. Autumn in Manhattan had given way to winter, and the first snow of the year was gently falling over the city when the Eleanor Westfield Center for the Arts opened its doors for its official grand opening. The contrast between the white flakes and the restored historic facade created an almost magical image, as if nature itself was blessing this new beginning. Emma adjusted the pearl necklace that Eleanor had given her that morning, a family piece that had once belonged to Charlotte Westfield. "To remember that some traditions are worth keeping," Eleanor had said, "especially those that connect us to the strong women who came before us." The center's main hall was unrecognizable. The walls, once peeling, now displayed a careful curation of local and international art. Students in the Brooklyn pilot program had contributed impressive installations, proving that talent and opportunity, when brought together, could create magic. "It's surreal to think it all started with a humiliation at the plaza," Catherine Walsh commented, approaching Emma. "Look at you now. You turned a social scandal into a cultural revolution." Charles, across the room, was talking to a group of investors, but his eyes were constantly searching for Emma. She looked stunning in an emerald green dress that made her red hair shine like fire under the salon lights. More important than her appearance, however, was the natural confidence she radiated. No longer the shy teacher hiding in the West Wing, but a transformative force in her own right. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eleanor took the microphone, her voice carrying decades of social authority. "Welcome to the opening of the Eleanor Westfield Arts Center. While I am deeply honored by the name, this place represents much more than my personal legacy. It represents a new era for the Westfields, one that embraces not only business excellence but also social responsibility and cultural transformation. The audience, a unique mix of business elite and local artists, applauded enthusiastically. Emma noticed Victoria Bennett discreetly positioned at the back of the room, her face revealing a complex mix of regret and admiration. Charles took the stage next, adjusting the microphone with an ease that previously masked insecurity but now reflected genuine confidence. When I met Emma one rainy night in Boston, she was teaching Pride and Prejudice to a group of adults after work. I remember thinking how she made classic literature seem relevant and vibrant to people who had spent all day at work. What I didn't realize at the time was that she was teaching me a much more important lesson about authenticity and courage. Emma felt tears forming in her eyes as Charles continued. For years, I tried to shape our lives to fit expectations that were not ours. I hid the brightest light of my life in the shadows for fear of what others would think. Today, this center represents not only a new direction for the Westfields, but my own journey of redemption. When Emma took the stage to join her husband, the silence in the room was palpable. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing not just an inauguration, but the culmination of a profound personal and social transformation. This center, Emma began, her voice clear and confident, is more than a space for art and education. It is a symbol of how we can transform our greatest vulnerabilities into our greatest strength. Every room in this building bears the name of a woman who contributed to the arts or education in New York, because we believe that recognizing those who came before us is just as important as creating opportunities for those who come after. The night progressed like a carefully orchestrated dream. Performances by students from the Brooklyn program mixed with performances by established artists. Conversations about mergers and acquisitions shared space with passionate discussions about painting techniques and the social impact of the arts. Close to midnight, as the last guests began to leave, Emma found Charles in the building's old library, now transformed into a reading and music room. He was standing by the window, watching the snow that continued to fall. "I thought I'd find you here," she said softly, moving closer. "Libraries seem to play an important role in our history." Charles smiled, extending his hand to her. "I remember exactly the book you were holding that first night in Boston. It was an old edition of Pride and Prejudice, with the worn blue cover. And you tried to impress by quoting Mr. Darcy." Emma laughed, lacing her fingers through his. "Little did I know that I was about to experience my own version of Pride Redemption," Charles replied, pulling her closer. The moment was interrupted by Eleanor, who silently entered the library. "Sorry to interrupt, but I thought you might like to see this." She handed Emma an envelope. "Catherine just handed it to me. It's the first official donation to the center's scholarship program." The check, signed by the Walsh Foundation, was accompanied by a simple note. "To remember that sometimes our greatest challenges become our greatest blessings. With admiration, Catherine." As snow continued to fall on Manhattan, 3 generations of Westfield transformation contemplated the future with a clarity that only comes after facing and overcoming one's shadows. The Eleanor Westfield Art Center was not just a renovated building. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to the transformative power of love when it is strong enough to overcome pride and prejudice. And so, in the library where it all began and ended, Emma and Charles Westfield found not only redemption, but also a new beginning, one that promised to be as bright as the lights of Manhattan reflected in the freshly fallen snow.